They say history is written by kings, yet some of its most unforgettable figures never wore a crown. Instead, they shaped destiny from the shadows, altering the course of kingdoms not by bloodline, but by influence, charm, and the dangerous intimacy of being close to a ruler. These men were often resented, envied, and hated with a passion that could rival the fear of armies. They were favorites, companions elevated far above their station, who sometimes rose higher than any baron or duke dared to climb. And among them, none burned more brightly or fell more violently than Piers Gaveston. He was not a king, but his story would become one of England's most infamous tales of loyalty, ambition, betrayal, and brutal death. History often consigns royal favorites to the margins, treating them as footnotes. But Piers Gaveston refused to remain in the background. He was flamboyant, daring, and impossible to ignore. His life is not merely a tale of companionship. It is a saga of a relationship so consuming it undermined the monarchy itself. Around him stood a weak king desperate for affection, a queen pushed to humiliation, and a nobility willing to risk everything to restore their grip on power. The rise and fall of Gaveston was not a quiet decline. It was an explosion that echoed for centuries, a lesson written in cruelty and blood about the dangers of overreaching influence. At the center of it all was King Edward II. He was the fourth son of Edward I, remembered by history as the Hammer of the Scots, a ruler forged in steel, unyielding in command, and relentless in his pursuit of conquest. But Edward II bore little resemblance to his father. Where the old king thrived in war, the son preferred leisure. Where the father commanded with discipline, the son sought out theatrics and pleasures. He was not a warrior king, but a man who longed for intimacy in a world that valued strength above all. His weaknesses were evident even before he wore the crown, and into this fragile space stepped Piers Gaveston, a man who seemed destined to take advantage of them. Gaveston himself was not born into grandeur. His father, a minor Gascon knight, lived on the edges of nobility. Respectable, yes, but worlds away from the circles of true power. Yet what Piers lacked in noble blood, he made up for in presence. He was striking in appearance, sharp in wit, and brimming with a confidence that dared others to underestimate him. He understood people. He could charm, disarm, and dominate a room without lifting a sword. It was this rare magnetism that captivated Prince Edward when they met around the year 1300. From that day, their bond was undeniable. Chroniclers describe a connection deeper than friendship, one that blurred the boundaries between loyalty, affection, and something more dangerous, obsession. What terrified England's barons was not what might have happened in private, but what was displayed openly for all to see. Edward did not hide Gaveston. He flaunted him. He showered him with affection, consulted him in matters of state, and elevated him in ways that challenged the very order of the kingdom. To the proud nobility, it was intolerable. And to Edward I, the formidable king who still ruled, it was unacceptable. By 1306, the elder monarch had seen enough. Viewing Gaveston as a corrosive influence on his son and a danger to royal dignity, he ordered him into exile. The message was clear. This foreign-born upstart was a threat to the crown itself. But Edward, still Prince of Wales at the time, did not forget. He did not forgive. He carried his fury like a wound, waiting for the moment when he would wield true power. That moment came in July of 1307, when Edward I died. His son, now king, wasted no time in making his intentions clear. Before even planning his coronation, Edward II recalled Gaveston from exile. The return was not simply a restoration, it was a triumph. Gaveston was granted immense wealth, lands across the realm, and the prestigious earldom of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty. It was a shocking display of favoritism that reverberated across England like a thunderclap. At Edward's coronation in 1308, the insult to the nobility became unbearable. Gaveston arrived in robes so glittering, so heavy with jewels, that he seemed to rival the king himself. Chroniclers claimed his brilliance outshone even Edward's regalia. Worse still, Gaveston made no attempt to hide his disdain for the lords of the realm. He mocked them with satirical poems, ridiculing men who commanded armies and lands. He performed these verses with theatrical delight, reducing barons to laughingstocks before their peers. It was not just disrespect, it was humiliation, and it cut deeply. For Edward, it was intoxicating. Gaveston was more than a companion. He was an extension of himself, a mirror that reflected the king's desires and defiance back at the world. But for the nobility, it was war. They saw in Gaveston not only an arrogant outsider, but a man who had taken the king's heart and, through it, the kingdom's reins. To them, this was not politics, it was survival. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. What began as whispers in corridors soon erupted into open conflict. And at the center of it all stood Piers Gaveston, a man who had climbed higher than anyone of his station had ever dreamed, but who would soon learn that the higher the climb, the deadlier the fall. But while Gaveston basked in the king's favor, Queen Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, was sidelined. Only 12 at the time of their marriage, she was a political pawn meant to secure peace between England and France. Trained in the art of courtly manipulation, Isabella quickly learned the truth. In England, power belonged to whoever controlled the king, and Gaveston controlled him entirely. By 1310, the nobility had had enough. Led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the Lords Ordainers set out to reform the royal household, but their real goal was to remove Gaveston. In 1311, they forced Edward to exile him once again. But Edward's obsession could not be quelled. Within months, Gaveston was back, and the king threatened civil war to keep him safe. The barons responded decisively. In 1312, Gaveston was captured while fleeing and taken to Blacklow Hill near Warwick. There was no trial, no ceremony, only a swift execution. His head was struck from his body like that of a common criminal. When the news of Gaveston's death reached King Edward, it broke him in ways that no enemy could. He shut himself away for days, locking the doors of his chamber and refusing to see his counselors or even touch food. Some whispered through the corridors of the palace that his cries and anguished screams carried far into the night, echoing against the stone walls. Others swore that he clutched Gaveston's final letter in his hands, reading it aloud again and again until his voice collapsed into hoarse silence. Whatever the truth, the image was the same. A king undone, a man shattered by grief. Yet grief is rarely still. For Edward, sorrow quickly hardened into something darker: vengeance. From that moment on, his rule became unstable and erratic. He withdrew from allies, alienated his supporters, and allowed the foundations of his crown to weaken. Out of this turmoil, another figure rose to fill the void Gaveston had left behind, one who would prove to be even more dangerous. This man was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unlike Gaveston, whose charm and mockery had earned him both love and hate, Despenser sought not simply the king's favor, but absolute control. His ambition was not playful, it was consuming. He destroyed those who opposed him with ruthless efficiency. Estates were seized without hesitation, noble families stripped of their lands and titles, and enemies were systematically disinherited. Despenser forged secret alliances with judges, bent the legal system to his will, and grew wealthy by confiscating whatever he desired. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, shared his lust for power, and together the two men formed a dynasty of intimidation and fear. But Despenser the Younger made one mistake Gaveston never had. He turned his cruelty toward the queen herself. He publicly insulted Queen Isabella, accused her of treason without cause, and even sought to control her finances. That single miscalculation would plant the seeds of his eventual destruction. In 1324, the fragile ties between England and France unraveled. Tensions reached their breaking point, and Edward II, blinded by loyalty to Despenser, lashed out. In a calculated act meant to diminish his queen's influence, he stripped Isabella of her lands and confined her within the court, reducing her to a powerless figurehead. Edward believed she remained the timid child of 12 he had married years before. But he had gravely underestimated her. Isabella had watched quietly for years, learning the intricate games of power. She had endured humiliation and neglect, but beneath the silence, she had built her own network of allies. Despenser's arrogance had given her the opening she needed. Her vengeance would not be immediate, nor would it be loud. It would be deliberate, patient, and absolute. History often pivots on quiet moments, when whispers become storms and hidden betrayals ignite revolutions. This was one such moment. Isabella, Queen of England, refused to remain a pawn. She was determined to seize her destiny, even if it meant dismantling everything around her. By Edward's side, Hugh Despenser tightened his grip, hungrier with each passing day. His rise was not the product of loyalty or service, but of manipulation, deceit, and the blood of those he crushed beneath him. And yet, like a tower built on shifting sand, his power carried within it the certainty of collapse. Isabella, however, was not an ordinary queen. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, her bloodline itself a weapon. But it was not simply her lineage that made her dangerous. It was her patience, her sharp intelligence, and her ability to weave alliances with care. As Edward descended further into dependence on Despenser, Isabella began her quiet rebellion. She reached out to her brother, Charles IV of France, securing his ear and sympathy. She courted the support of disaffected English barons who had long despised the Despensers. These men saw the future with dread, certain that if Edward's reign continued, Despenser's tyranny would swallow England whole. In 1325, Isabella was dispatched to France under the guise of diplomacy. Her mission, in name, was to negotiate peace between the two kingdoms. In truth, it was to rally support against her own husband's rule. While she worked in France, Despenser's grip on England only tightened further. He manipulated the king's advisors, dominated parliament, enriched himself by stripping nobles of their wealth, and ruled with a cruelty so open that even his allies began to question him. Estates were seized, laws twisted to his advantage, and heavy taxes drained the people to fund his luxuries. To the kingdom at large, he had become the embodiment of corruption, a parasite feeding on the crown. By 1326, Isabella was ready. With French military forces at her back and the loyalty of rebel English lords secured, she sailed to England and landed at Ipswich. But she did not return as a meek queen obeying her king. She returned as the leader of an invasion, commanding an uprising. Her demands seemed simple: the removal of Hugh Despenser. Yet it carried the force of revolution. The barons, already embittered and disillusioned, rose to her side. Edward faltered, torn between the wife he had underestimated and the favorite he could not release. As Isabella's forces marched across England, Despenser attempted to escape, but his flight was futile. He was captured and brought to Hereford. His trial was a formality, the verdict determined before a single word was spoken. On November 24th, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger faced his reckoning. His execution was designed not only to kill him, but to obliterate his legacy. The sentence was carried out in the most brutal public spectacle imaginable: castration, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Crowds gathered, many of them victims of his greed and cruelty, and they watched as justice was delivered in its harshest form. For the people, it was a moment of catharsis. For Isabella, it was cold satisfaction, not joy. She had done what none had believed possible. She had destroyed the most corrupt figure in Edward's court. But in doing so, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had not only rid England of Despenser, she had effectively dethroned her own husband. The political order of the kingdom had been rewritten, and though the tyrant was gone, the scars of his reign lingered. Hugh Despenser's fall was more than the end of a favorite. It was the moment when a queen transformed from pawn to player, and in doing so, altered the fate of England forever. As Isabella marched into London, the streets erupted with a roar of triumph. Bells rang from church towers, banners fluttered above the city gates, and the people poured into the narrow lanes to witness the victorious queen's arrival. Yet beneath the jubilation lay a quiet, unspoken truth. This was not the conclusion of a struggle, but the beginning of an even greater and more dangerous chapter. Edward II was broken, stripped of his allies, and left with nothing but the crumbling shadow of his crown. His throne, once secure, now hung by a thread. Isabella had emerged as the victor of a bitter conflict, but in victory, she faced a perilous dilemma. The road ahead was not paved with peace, but with treachery, doubt, and the haunting realization that in seizing power, she risked becoming the very tyrant she had fought so hard to destroy. Far from the noise of celebration, Edward II languished in the cold confines of captivity. The halls that had once echoed with the authority of his voice now stood silent, replaced by the oppressive weight of chains and stone walls. He was no longer a king, but a prisoner, robbed not only of royal authority, but of his dignity as a man. The crown he once wore was gone, and with it the illusion of strength. His prison was more than physical. It was a construct of betrayal. The very hands that had sworn loyalty to him now turned the key in his cell door. Those who had once called him Lord had discarded him like a broken relic, unfit for the kingdom he once ruled. In the court of his queen, the verdict on his fate had been decided long before his imprisonment. Isabella of France had not sailed across the channel to restore her husband's power. She had come to claim it for herself, with no intention of compromise. This was not a mission of reconciliation. It was a calculated campaign of conquest, executed with deliberate precision. Isabella of France, once sidelined as a powerless consort, now stood firmly at the center of England's turbulent political stage. No longer the young bride bartered away by her father, no longer the humiliated wife overshadowed by her husband's favorites. Isabella now commanded authority in her own right. With the might of French allies at her back and the loyalty of formidable English barons such as Thomas of Lancaster and Hugh Audley, she wove a web of alliances so intricate that she was no longer bound by the roles imposed on her. She was no longer the pawn. She had become the player, moving pieces across the board of power with ruthless clarity. Once a figure of pity and endurance, Isabella transformed herself into a figure of strategy and ambition, reshaping not only her own destiny, but the destiny of an entire kingdom. The execution of Hugh Despenser, Edward's most notorious favorite, marked a turning point. His brutal death sent shockwaves through the realm, and the atmosphere in court became heavy with anticipation. The question now hung over everyone. What would Isabella do with the king himself? Edward was not the man she had married all those years ago. His authority had dissolved, his dignity eroded, his strength reduced to dust. Once feared, he was now pitted, and in the ruthless theater of medieval kingship, pity was a death sentence. Whispers became certainties. The king would be forced to abdicate. This was more than the removal of a ruler. It was a shattering of sacred tradition, a rupture of the ancient bond between sovereign and realm. A deposed king was not just a fallen man. He was a living wound in the body of the kingdom. Yet for Isabella, this course was unavoidable. Her legitimacy as ruler depended on stripping Edward of his title. To rule England, she had to extinguish the shadow of his authority once and for all. When Edward was pushed from power, the machinery of a new order came into motion. Isabella's allies, once united in rebellion, now turned to their own rewards. Vast estates shifted into new hands, fortunes swelled, titles were reshaped, and families like the Mortimers and the Audleys found themselves richer and more powerful than ever before. The spoils of victory flowed freely. But in medieval England, loyalty was never a matter of devotion. It was a matter of ambition. The unity that had carried Isabella to victory began to fracture. Those who had fought at her side now jostled for their own advancement, their eyes fixed on personal gain rather than the cause that had bound them together. The seeds of discord, once buried beneath the urgency of rebellion, began to sprout in the fertile soil of greed. By the dawn of 1327, Edward II was no longer king. His fall was complete, devastating and irreversible. What had begun as a marital union ended as political annihilation. Isabella, the woman who once stood at his side, now stood as the architect of his destruction. Edward's fate was grim and humiliating. He was not allowed to retire quietly into obscurity, nor was he granted the dignity of a peaceful exile. Instead, he was confined in isolation, humiliated in both body and spirit, reduced to a living testament of England's ruthless political world. The stories of his end spread quickly, whispers of suffocation, torture, and horrors too cruel to speak aloud. Yet the truth remained clouded. Did Isabella order his death outright, or did her allies act on their own, determined to eliminate a threat that still lingered? History offers no certain answer, but the outcome was unmistakable. Edward II was gone, and with his death, the last obstacle to Isabella's uncontested rule vanished into silence. Yet Isabella did not stand alone in power. At her side was Roger Mortimer, her lover, her confidant, and her political partner. Together they ruled through her son, the young Edward III. But the boy's crown was little more than a symbol, a piece of gilded ornamentation masking the reality that real authority lay elsewhere. Mortimer's influence grew rapidly, overshadowing even Isabella herself. He was the one who forged treaties, pulled the strings of government, and directed the machinery of the realm. What had once been Isabella's triumph began to feel like her undoing. The crown she had fought for so fiercely no longer seemed a prize, but a cage. The dynamic of her marriage to Edward II seemed to repeat itself with chilling familiarity. Once again, she was overshadowed by the ambitions of man. Mortimer's arrogance and thirst for dominance alienated allies and created enemies. By 1330, the cracks in their regime had widened into dangerous fissures. The young Edward III, no longer content to be a passive puppet, struck decisively. Mortimer was seized and executed, condemned not just for his political offenses, but for the sheer scale of his ambition. With his death, Isabella was stripped of her authority. She retained the ceremonial dignity of Queen Mother, but the true levers of power were firmly placed in her son's hands. Isabella's later years were marked by withdrawal. Some accounts claim she sought refuge in a convent, devoting herself to reflection and solitude. Others suggest she lingered quietly at the edges of politics, never again in command, but never completely absent. Whatever the reality, her time as England's most formidable woman had ended. She had climbed higher than any queen of her era, but that ascent had cost her dearly: her marriage, her allies, her reputation, and perhaps even her sense of self. Her legacy is one of contradiction. She was both a victor and a cautionary tale. She reshaped England's political landscape, yet her ambition brought chaos and mistrust. Her reign is remembered less for peace and stability than for upheaval and betrayal. In her pursuit of vengeance and authority, she dismantled not only the rule of a king, but much of her own humanity. History could not define her simply as villain or heroine. She was a ruler who defied expectations, who reached beyond the limitations of her time, yet ultimately became ensnared by the very power she sought to wield. And as the centuries passed, one haunting question remained. Was it worth it? The throne, the authority, the vengeance, were they worth the cost of the life she might have lived without them? Perhaps the answer lies not in her victories or in her rise, but in the silence that followed.